Hi everybody, okay, welcome back. We're looking today at Jeremy Duff, Elements of New Testament Greek. We're in section 6.5, in the second half of section 6.5, and we're looking at the next one of the little complexities that arises when you try to add an epsilon augment to some verbs in order to make it into an imperfect or an aorist. Check out the previous videos in this chapter for some of the background to this. What we're thinking about here is about compound verbs. Now, you might need to refresh your memory about what a compound verb is. You can find all these details back in chapter 4, and there's a separate video on that section. A compound verb is a verb like any of these, where, let's take ekballo for an example. Ekballo. The verb ballo has been compounded with the preposition ek. So ballo, I throw, has become ekballo, I drive out, or I throw out, or something of that sort. Now, what happens when you try to add an epsilon augment to a verb like this? Well, you might be tempted just to wade blindly in and slap it on the beginning of the verb. That would be a mistake, because remember what we said right back 2 or 3 videos ago when we introduced the idea of epsilon augments and sigma suffixes. We said that they both attach respectively to the beginning and the end of the stem of the verb. The stem of the verb. So where is the stem in ekballo? It is, of course, bal. And therefore, the epsilon augment, when you want to make it into an imperfect, is not going to attach here, but rather in here. Not there, but in there. So what it's going to look like is, well, let's do the stem out here first. We need the stem still. Bal. We'll pop the ending on, the imperfect ending just for now, because we may as well put the ending on. We need to put the epsilon augment in there with no breathing, because it's now not at the beginning of the word, it's in the middle of the word, because you still need to put the preposition back on, which is the preposition, well, it's not ek, is it? And again, if you've forgotten about this tiny detail, just head back and look at page 48, where you'll be reminded that ekbalon in circumstances like this turned into exebalon. Now, that's not, this change from ek to x is not the point at issue right here. Just go back and look at page 48. And I'm just going to turn there and I can explain it to you in a bit more detail now, where it talks about prepositions and how they change when they are placed before a vowel. Basically, ek becomes x when it's placed before a vowel if the vowel is in the next word. Well, the same thing happens if the vowel is in the same word. Ek goes to x. And that's all back on there on page 48. So go back and take a look at that, revise that. But here, for our purposes, what we're wanting to highlight is that the epsilon augment goes at the beginning of the stem, not at the beginning of the word, and leaves us, therefore, with exebalon. I was throwing out, or I was driving out. Okay, so that's one little complexity. And what we need to do now is look at how that figures in these other verbs. So let's try it with the next verb, hupago, I set free, or something of that sort. Well, what's going on here? Well, we've actually got the preposition hupo added to the verb ago. Hupago, hupo, ago. So where are we going to attach the epsilon augment here? Well, the epsilon augment goes on the beginning of the stem, which is ag, and so that's going to attach in here. But we know from the previous video where we were talking about contractions, as Duff calls them, if you add an epsilon augment to a verb that begins with a vowel, like alpha, then, well, in the case of alpha, the epsilon augment plus the alpha, epsilon plus alpha, goes to an eta. And so when we put the epsilon at the beginning of this verb, we're going to get this. ergo. In fact, we're not going to have O, we're going to have on if we're making it imperfect. Let's put the correct ending on. Ergon. And then we do the same thing with the preposition as before. We put hupo in there, but the omicron elides, that is, it experiences elision, it just disappears, as again described back in page 48 or thereabouts in the section on prepositions. So hupago goes to hupergon, where we say the epsilon augment has contracted, as in the previous video when you're adding it to something like akuo. So it makes sense? So ekbalo goes to exebalon, where you just slap the epsilon augment in there at the beginning of the stem. No other changes apart from the one that you should already have known about. Ek goes to X in front of a vowel. In this case, you put the epsilon augment at the start of the verb, and that then needs to contract, as in the previous section, 6.5.1, as an extra level of complexity to give you hupergon. Okay, so now what happens if we have something, let me get rid of those details, if we have a verb like this, apoluo. Apoluo. Right, well, let's just figure out what's going on here. We've got an apo and a luo. And when we want to make this imperfect by adding an epsilon augment, the same thing would apply, of course, if we're making it aorist, but we'll stick to imperfect. If we want to make it imperfect, we want to put the epsilon augment in here at the start of the stem. The stem is lu. All right, so let's pop that in here. There's the stem. There's the epsilon augment. Let's put the imperfect ending in as well. Eluon. And then what we need to do is replace the preposition back at the beginning of the verb again. So let's try that. Here goes. Apo. Apo eluon. Hold on a second. And then you realise you really did need to be paying attention in chapter 4, because in this case we have an extra vowel at the end of the preposition, the omicron, and that preposition then obeys the same rules of elision, not contraction. This is contraction. This obeys the same rules of elision as in chapter 4, and because it's followed by a vowel apo, is followed by an epsilon, the o, omicron, in the preposition disappears, or we say elides, and we're left with ap eluon through elision. So just to go through that again, you've got 3 different ways in which you can get confused in section 6.5.2. The first is you need to remember to put the epsilon augment at the beginning of the stem, and that's always the case in all these examples. And so ekbalo becomes, well, the ekbalon, and this becomes exebalon because of the change in the preposition ex. So that's the first thing. At the beginning of the stem, not at the beginning of the verb if it's a compound verb. Second, in cases like hupago, when the verb begins with a vowel, then we have the same rules of contraction that were discussed in section 6.5.1, where an epsilon plus an alpha goes to an eta, an epsilon plus an eta goes to an eta, and an epsilon plus an omicron goes to an omega, and so on. And that's all discussed in the previous video. So, beginning of the stem, the rule of contraction, and then thirdly, the rule of elision, which is not to do with there being a vowel at the beginning of the stem, but to do with there being a vowel at the end of the preposition. If there's a vowel at the end of the preposition, then once you've added the epsilon augment in the appropriate place, it elides or undergoes elision and leaves you, as in this case, with ap elu on. Okay, good. All right, so that's section 6.5, those little complexities that arise with adding epsilon augments to verbs. when you're making the imperfect and the aorist. Next video we'll go on and look at section 6.6, and we'll notice a couple of other quirks about the sigma suffix, which again initially look a bit puzzling, but really they're very simple. There's a kind of logic to them, and then we'll be able to move on, and we are really getting towards the end of this chapter. You're doing a great job. Just a couple more sections to go before we're able to do the questions at the end of the chapter and move on to the next stage. All right, God bless. Bye for now. Keep praying for each other, praying for me. Remember to subscribe if you want to get the latest videos as soon as they're released, and we'll have you reading the New Testament in Greek in no time at all. Bye for now.